Welcome back, podcast fans. I'm your host, Annette Hines, and this is Parenting Impossible, the Special Needs Survival Podcast. And although I am recording this in the middle of summer, we are here to talk about getting ready for your next school year, and especially IEPs and educational advocacy. And my special guest today, April Rehrig, is someone who knows all about that. I am just floored by her credentials. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about her. She's the founder of Rise Educational Advocacy and Consulting, and she spent over 20 years as an elementary school teacher and a school psychologist in LA. You cannot get much more experience than that. I mean, that just says it all. I've always wanted to talk with somebody who's had experience both on the side of being the educational provider as well as being the advocate, because I find personally that it's so hard for teachers especially to advocate for their students. But also, let me tell you that she is a licensed educational psychologist and board certified special education advocate, that's BCEA fellow. She attended COPA, which is the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, an organization that I love so much, SEAT 2.0 and 3.0 programs. And she's a certified autism spectrum disorder clinical specialist, as well as a master IEP coach. Yay! She has so much to tell us about today. She's a parent advocate and an IEP coach, and does a lot of do-it-yourself guides to help you help yourself, basically. So she's happy for you to get started on a free consultation with her, and we're going to have all her links in the show notes. So make sure you go and check her out. It's amazing. All right, April, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have this conversation. And as I mentioned to you, I have a little cold, so I'm sorry that I'm so nasally, but I wanted to make sure that we got this recording in so that we could get all this great information out to people before the start of the school year. So welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Annette.
So let's talk about that school year. I mentioned to you before the show started that it's such a big ordeal every year for parents getting ready. And I know that you are a super duper advocacy coach. So let's talk about that first and foremost. How does a parent or a caregiver just mentally prepare themselves for another year? And for so many families, it's another year of battles.
Such a great question. I guess to answer the question, there's kind of two different ways that I would prepare. I'm a mom myself with IEP kids. So a lot of the stuff that I talk about is sure, it's all the, the credentials and the things that I have, but honestly, a lot of the stuff I've learned in the trenches. And so what I do with my kids, what I do when I recommend and I work with families is two different things. So if your listener is a parent of a child who already has an IEP, going into the next school year that you're probably going to have a whole new set of people on your IEP team. There might be a new speech pathologist, there might be a new school psychologist, there might be a new special education case carrier. So that is one kind of avenue to prepare, is for your new team. And if you're a parent of a child with a disability who doesn't have an IEP, or maybe you have a 504 plan, or you're new to the school district, then it's kind of a different layer of preparation. The key with preparing for the school year, whether you're an existing parent with a child with an IEP or you're a new parent or a new family, is two different things. So it comes down to documentation, Annette, and communication. So that is the name of the game, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a school psych like myself, or even an advocate. That is where we struggle the most. So when it comes to the fall and starting up school, you want to, first of all, communicate with your team by sending a really quick email as soon as the school year starts. You don't want to do it before, because you might not know, like, who is my teacher?
Right.
Who is my child's case carrier? Or if you're at a new school, who is the person in charge of 504 plans? So kind of finding out who is on your team. And then once the week starts, not the first day of school, because the teachers get really overloaded. And if you're a case carrier or provider, your list changes of like who you're working with day by day.
Yeah.
So wait about a week in, but then send a really quick introductory email. I usually send it to the administrator in charge, like your principal or your assistant principal, saying, hi, I'm so-and-so. Maybe you're new to the district and like, I'd like to know who my case carrier is. Can you let me know who my team is so I can get their emails and their contact information? That's one way to prep for the year. And then if you already have a team, then maybe reaching out to that same administrator and saying, hey, this is my team from last year. Can you give me the name and the emails of my current team members? That's like the biggest thing, is that communication factor. And then once you get that information, Annette, then it comes down to documentation. So then it's like, hey, we're starting out. I just kind of want to quickly touch base with my team. It
Right.
does not mean you send an email as a mom and it's like a page long, like here
Right.
is the stuff. It's much more like, hi, how are you? I want to check in. I want to let you know that I'm a, really involved parent and I'm super excited to work with you. So you're setting the tone for
Yes.
collaboration and cooperation, and you're also introducing yourself. So that is like the number one thing that I can recommend to parents starting the year, because if you wait a month, if you wait 2 months, and then you're like, oh my gosh, there's a problem, my
Yeah.
child's having meltdowns, then you don't know who to talk to or where to go. So I find just that really quick, like getting the contacts and getting a quick email hello
Mhm.
is huge.
That's amazing advice, really. You're setting yourself up as a resource for the team, as opposed to, here's a problem, and starting off right away with the first problem that happens. Now they hear from you. So setting yourself up for them to talk to you as a resource, so smart. That's great. Thank you. So for those who are really early on in this process, can you just quickly describe the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan?
Yes, it's a question I get asked all the time, and I'm laughing just because parents ask this question, and honestly, Annette, I get so many people who reach out to me, and they are teachers and they are school psychologists.
Mhm.
So your question pertains to everybody. When it comes down to an IEP and a 504 plan, both of them are considered what's called an education plan, and both of them fall under the provision of FAPE, meaning that both an IEP and a 504 plan have to offer a free, appropriate public education. So the difference is between an IEP and a 504 in a nutshell is that a 504 will be giving access and providing equity in terms of leveling the playing field for a child with either an actual or a suspected disability. A 504 plan can offer services. That's one huge myth. And a 504 plan can go with you from pre-K all the way up to college if you apply for and get accepted and enrolled in the post-secondary institution, but you have to do that process separately. An IEP would be through pre-K through high school, or if you age out or graduate from high school. And with an IEP, that would be related to meeting the criteria. There's 13 eligibility areas. So in order to qualify for an IEP, you have to be a disabled child that meets one of those 13 eligibility areas. You have to be able to access the core curriculum. You need that specialized academic instruction, or what we call special education or related services. So kind of the differences in a nutshell between an IEP and a 504 plan is one is going to have goals and objectives, a set point person who's going to work with your child and deliver that special education or related services. And you're also going to have checks and balances in the IEP, like stay put status and ability to ask for an IEE, goals and objectives, progress monitoring, versus a 504 is kind of broad-based. You can qualify for a 504 on a federal mandate. There's not all these state or specific areas that you need this and this and this to meet the criteria. And with a 504, you typically are getting more access and equity to services. So it's more about, can my child meet this area? Can my child access this? Or does my child need, maybe related services in order to get this or be in the specific place? So that's
Right.
sort of in a nutshell, the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan.
That was excellent. Thank you for that explanation. I know that people do get confused all the time, especially when your district tells you that they want to terminate the IEP and move someone to a 504. It can be very confusing, or they're offering a 504 instead of an IEP. And, why is that? So I know that that comes up quite a bit, actually. And as you said, many professionals as well as families are confused about the difference. And I always think about an IEP is really a contract that has a lot of rights associated with it.
Mhm.
504s have rights associated with it as well, but it is
Mhm.
not a contract in the same way. So it's a little different. And
Mhm.
we find that 504s are often offered for students who have medical issues, someone who maybe needs their, is diabetic, needs insulin or needs medication during the day, but otherwise can access education in a, in the traditional format, or maybe they have inability based on being a wheelchair user and need accommodations in the classroom, or, deaf or hard of hearing, things like that. So, all right, that was great. So now we really want to talk about one of your favorite subjects, which is language in the IEP and why language matters. And I know we're going to spend quite a few minutes talking about this. Why don't we start with the overall, when you're talking about language in an IEP, what are you talking about exactly? How goals are drafted? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is an area, Annette, that I'm really passionate about because when I was a teacher and a school psychologist and also a mom, I found that language can be a blessing and can be one of the biggest barriers, to be honest with you, for children to access services.
Mhm.
And when I talk about barriers, I'm talking about the fact and the truth of the matter is that language forms the perceptions and expectations for what we expect that kids are going to do in a school setting. So, case in point, when I was a teacher, and your teachers are going to nod their head when they listen to this, I would get at the beginning of the school year my list who's in my class, who has an IEP and a 504 plan, and here's what I would be told. And this is in every school district I worked in. I would be told, okay, April, you have student A, B, and C, and they have this disability, and they're receiving OT, PT, and they really struggle with this, and they have a behavior plan. Did they tell me the strengths? No. Did it capture the child's unique learning needs? No. Did I get to see a copy of their entire IEP? Never. It would usually be a very quick, here's their accommodations, here's their services. So I formed expectations. That's only natural. We're human because
Right.
that's all I was told. That's all I was told. So that means that's where I'm setting the bar for what I expect the child to do.
Mm.
When I was a parent and I would read over my child's psych report every time I would cry. Why would I cry? Because I was told my child can't do this. My child can't do this.
Right.
Here's where they're struggled. It was very rare that I got an assessment report, especially with school psychologists. And I'm not blaming us. This is just the way we're honestly trained to
Yeah.
say, here is where your child excels. Here is the things that your child needs that are the underlying and the performance conditions so they can access the curriculum. That
Right.
wasn't part of our training as a school psychologist. So, meaning we focused on the deficits, we focused on the standardized test scores. That is devastating as a parent to only hear the deficits, to only hear that. And as a teacher, if I'm going to be working with a child in my classroom, I want to hear the strengths. And
Right.
the reason why is when we talk about language and we talk about data per se, data means nothing unless it's functionally based. So when you think about language in an IEP, it needs to capture the child's entire profile. So if we break down the language, we need to organize it in terms of what they can do, which is
Mhm.
the strengths. And this is where we're going to focus the accommodations, the modifications, right? All those supplementary services is focusing on accommodations because that's what they can do. Then we need to focus on their unique learning needs, which is what they don't know. We should also see that in the present levels of performance in terms of the baseline.
Mhm.
Then we look at what do they need to learn? This is where are we going to go? So
Yeah.
this has to do with the language of what are the underlying and the performance conditions or the mastery or the incidental learning and how
Mhm.
they're going to demonstrate their knowledge. And then finally, the last portion of the language has to do with what is the impact of the disability and how are we going to address that? So all those four areas, Annette, need to be captured into the IEP. And that's one of the biggest challenges is that we're developing these plans which are more medically based and deficit based.
Right.
And they say the child's going to focus on doing this in the goal, but they don't talk about how are they going to get there? What are the setups and what does the child already know so that we can capitalize on their strengths and give them the access that they need?
I could not agree more. 100%, April. I see so many poorly drafted IEPs. I'm sure you do too. And it's not that the people who are doing the work don't care. The educational teams do care, but they see this IEP as an afterthought instead of the ability to actually come together and really think and strategize on behalf of the student. And I just love everything that you're saying. Can you give us an example of a well-drafted goal and action steps, and then something not so well drafted?
Yes, yes, yes. So people ask me this all the time. They're like, well, how do you write goals? And I always answer the question the same way. And that I say, well, we don't start with the goal. Most of the IEP or the most important part is never the goal. The most important part of the IEP is the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Why is that, Annette? It's because that's the baseline. That's what we need to see. So inside that present level section, we actually should be seeing the strengths, weaknesses, unique learning needs, impact of disability. So in that present level section, we need to be seeing, okay, here's the accommodations that are working for the child. Here's
Right.
what isn't working. Here's their underlying performance conditions. Here's their unique learning needs. All of that should be incorporated in the present level section. And then we draft the goal based on current present levels, whether it was an assessment done or
Yeah.
the updates that the teachers or providers were given. So then when we develop the goal, we say, okay, where are we now? There's the baseline, right? And we use
Right.
that baseline monitoring for the strengths, the weaknesses, unique performance conditions. And then we say, we're here now by this condition with these supports using A, B, and C, right? So that would be cueing, prompting, or all those kind of things. The child will be able to go from X to Y using this in blah, 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 out of 4 out of 5 trials based on, and it needs to be based on not just informal observations or whatever. It needs to be based on something tangible. So, for
Measurable.
example, when I was a school psychologist and I would counsel students, I really struggled to formulate goals because I was like, okay, it should be like they improve their self esteem. It should be this. And so I couldn't find any measurable data. And what I went back to is I started to realize, Annette, that if I'm counseling students because I'm doing an educationally related service, I'm helping them to access the curriculum. So if I was helping a child who was struggling with their self-esteem, I could address the goal that they were going to use self-advocacy techniques, 4 out of 5 trials, based on the number of participation they were exhibiting or based on their participation score in a classroom, what the teacher was saying on the report card grades.
Yeah.
So I transitioned it to something very tangible, and you could monitor that data and you could progress monitor really easily because it's
Mm.
connected to their grades and their performance instead of, well, it's based on how they're doing in counseling and based on what I think they should achieve because
Right.
it's not measurable.
Yeah.
So in essence, when you're formulating a goal, you're starting with the baseline. You're talking about how they're going to get there. And in the goal, you're embedding the accommodations, the modifications inside the actual goal. You're saying what they need to get there, and then demonstrating the conditions of mastery to get there.
Wow. I just keep saying this. That's really amazing. I love the way you boil this down for those of us not in your field to be able to really take and follow along with it. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that I've always noticed with my daughter's IEP, you know, many years ago when we were doing IEPs, that a lot of the historical data and information just never carried forward from year to year. Things that actually worked with her. So, hey, we found that when we present things to her from the right lower corner, she can see them better. She had low vision. And every year it was like starting over again instead of having those historical successes really, follow through. Also, there needs to be things on there that she doesn't like. So tactily, she didn't like to touch crinkly things. That needs to follow through as well, because that should never be one of the things that we try again, right?
That's absolutely true. And you bring up such a great point. So an example of that, what you're talking about, and I totally use this, is when I was a school psychologist and I would counsel students, I go back to this all the time because it was just so relevant, is I would talk about in my present levels page, I've been seeing this student for blah, blah, or they've been receiving school-based counseling for this. When given this, they are successful in A, B, and C. When
Yeah.
given this, they really struggle. So I'm talking about the effectiveness of the accommodations and the modifications. So you're not just saying like they met the goal, they didn't meet the goal, which you should be writing in your present levels page. But I also talked about the effectiveness of the accommodations, because that's one thing that tends to get missed. We look at the drop-down menu, or we get told as a mom, we're like, here's the drop-down. We're going to talk about this accommodation instead of having your child at the meeting and your child is saying, okay, this accommodation really, really works for me, or I never use that. Why is that there? So the effectiveness of the accommodations and that history that you're mentioning is so key. It saves time, because we both know that there's different providers every year at a meeting. You don't want to go back to square one for every single IEP.
That's right. That's right. And this brings us to your next point that you firmly believe, which is that parents make the best advocates for their children. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes. And this is one thing I'm so passionate about, because we're told, or it's implied so often, that we are not. Case in point, when your families walk into that first IEP, there is a team of people that you're walking into, and you sit there, and it doesn't matter your background, whether you are a professional or an attorney or a mom or a doctor. You walk into that meeting and you feel overwhelmed. You feel absolutely overwhelmed, and you are told, here are the experts that know about your child. And it's sort of implied, well, okay, they know what to do, and I'm just going to listen to them. And it's only when in your gut you start to feel something is not right. This does not feel right. And so you kind of get trained, or you trained yourself to second guess your judgment as a mom. And I want to push back on that, because you know your child better than anyone else. And the reality is, what we've already talked about, Annette, is that when you meet with your IEP team year after year, you are going to have new people on that team. And the truth of the matter is, you are the only member of the IEP team, the same member year after year. That means that,
you have all that historical data. You have all
exactly.
that contiguous knowledge, right?
Exactly. And you know what's worked, like you touched on, you know what doesn't work. So that gives you a lot of input. That also means, because you have that historical information that we touched on earlier, and that is that you can provide input. And when I talk about input, I talk about something called a parent letter of attachment, meaning that you can attach your information to the IEP and you can write what's called a parent report. So
Oh,
most parents come to the IEP and you're sitting there and everyone else has copies of here's my data,
yeah,
here's my report, here's my goal progress reports. Well, gosh darn it, you've been with your kid every day after school. You're doing homework, you're taking
yeah,
them to the therapy sessions. You have data, but it's in your head. Or maybe
right.
it's something that you're like, oh my gosh, every day they're having this, and this meltdown. Well, why not put that into a parent report? Why not attach that when you respond to the invitation for the meeting and say, here's what I am seeing at home. Here's the data that I am taking. They can incorporate that into the parent report and attach it to the
Yeah.
IEP under the present level section because you are a member of the team and you know your child better than anyone else. How
And it
powerful is that?
it doesn't have to be overwhelming, listeners.
No.
It can be just a few bullet points if that's what you've got to share and contribute. And certainly, it's that time of year where we make a lot of observations about our kids over the summer. Some have specialized programming, some don't, some have great programs that you've put together for them. And there are definitely things that they have learned. There are maybe some regressions. Sometimes that happens. There's a lot of stuff as your child grows up that you want to share with the next team. So it's a perfect time of year to go ahead and make that connection. And just remember what April said at the beginning of our conversation, that making that introduction so that when you have an IEP meeting, that's not the first time that you're meeting some of the people on the team. You've already introduced yourself to them. You've already given them a little bit of information. You've shared some things. It just, it's just the best advice. This is such a great set of tips for parents. Um, so you have a lot to say about standardized test scores. Let's talk about that a little bit because I am not a fan at all of standardized testing, and I don't think that it does our kiddos justice most of the time. So tell me, what do you think about that, April?
Yeah, so it's definitely a controversial topic, especially in the land of school psychology. And so many, I've been on actually many school psychology podcasts and spoken with different school psychologists leading in the prominent in the field, and many of them agree with me.
Wow.
And the reason why they agree is what we're seeing in the industry, and your parents may be nodding their head when I say this, is that many reports nowadays are focused on the legalese. And so as a school
Yeah.
psychologist or as any provider doing an IEP, we're being told by districts across the country, make your reports legal,
Oh.
write this, do this test, or give every test under the sun. And actually, under IDA law, it does not say that. It says that we need to give tests that are individualized, that are personalized, that are based on the child's unique learning needs, and those tests need to be cross-validated. So in the land of school psychology, when I was told how to write reports, one thing we were told is, okay, when you give a standardized test score, you need to cross-validate that with two other areas. That would be observations in two different settings by two different people, and you need to kind of say, okay, this standardized test says this area of deficit, and we're seeing it impact the child's functional performance
Mhm.
in A, B, and C.
Wow.
So that tends to get lost. And that's part of the school psychology profession. But unfortunately, it's sort of being pushed down, Annette, because AI is coming in. And
Yeah.
with a lot of AI special education assessments, they're using the AI generator that's writing those reports is just using standardized tests. There isn't an interpretation or an observational form that's kind of embedding and looking at that, saying this is related to this is related to that. And that's what's missing in many assessments. And so what
Mhm.
ends up happening is, and this happened to my client about a month ago, we got a 50-page report for an initial IEP and the child didn't qualify. And the reason why they didn't qualify is one standardized test score in one area. And the reality of the matter is that this child was failing, and the report cards were demonstrating that. All the MTSS data was saying they weren't making sufficient progress, but the AI generated report wasn't using that, and they weren't using the observations and all the data that the teacher was saying, that child is really struggling, they need help.
Mhm.
And so this is a huge problem. And
Wow.
so for your listeners, for your families, and for your teachers, I would push back and say, what are you seeing, school psychologists, in your observations? Or what are we seeing on those report card grades? Because those report card grades and those standardized test
Yeah.
scores, even all the interventions from MTSS that are out there, those have a lot of information.
Yeah.
And the standardized test scores are only capturing one test score, one data point. It's not the whole picture.
Right. Right. Yes. So true. And I've seen so many reports that are cookie cutter to the point where gotten reports that had the wrong kiddo's name in them. They're just sort of cutting and pasting the same things over and over again. And I'm concerned about AI and how this is being used without enough oversight. The professional is not stepping in and really taking a look at what's being produced and making
Mhm.
sure that it is individualized and appropriate. Because that's exactly what that sounded like when you were talking about it, that it's not individualized and appropriate for the student.
Yeah, that's true. When I used to write reports, we didn't have AI back, well, even 5 years ago, we didn't have AI in our reports, but we would use a computer generated thing to summarize, like a WISC, right? A standard IQ score. So we
Yeah.
would use that in our summary. But what I would do is I would take that summary of findings, Annette, and then I would say, here is what the IQ test said, and here's what it meant.
Mm.
So your team needs to know you can use AI generated reports. However, your report should not be only standardized test scores, and that interpretation, all the expertise, whether you're a school
Yes.
psychologist or speech path, those are so important. And when you look at the IEP document itself, it says under the present level section, present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. It says
Yeah.
functional. So that
Functional.
functional part needs to be written in the IEP.
Are we asking too much of our teachers and psychologists and other team members, because they generally have a lot of students that they work with, and these meetings and these reports take up a lot of their time? Are we asking too much for them to write these very specific reports and very detailed reports?
That's a great question. That's what the school psychologist, one of the guys was asking me. He's like, wow, that sounds really complicated. Doesn't it take a long time? And I said, well, actually, no. So many of the IEP documents that are written nowadays, for example, Annette, I looked at one yesterday from a big district in LA area. It was 48 pages long.
Mm.
And the reason why it was 48 pages is because the IEP software that they use was 48 pages. It had nothing to do with the
Oh,
child or their needs. It is a standard generated report.
wow.
And I mentioned this the other day, but as a parent and as a teacher, you can go to your district, you can go to SELPA, which is like a group of districts together, and say, you know what?
Yeah.
These forms are not working for our families, or these forms are not working for me as a parent. Can we talk about what's going to be on the form? So the IEPs themselves, the documents, it's not the child that's the issue. The issue is that there's so much legalese and there's so much boundaries that we're adding in the layer. So
Right.
over the past 20 years that I was a school psychologist, we were told to give more tests. We were told to write longer reports. And what I ended up doing is shortening my reports, giving less testing, but for each initial or for each triennial, or even what I call a record review, which is more of an abbreviated assessment, I would talk to the family before. I would say, what are you suspecting? What areas do you want me to test? These are the measures that I'm considering. What sounds good to you? And so I was individualizing the tests I was giving. I was using more narrative and more interpretation, less standardized tests. And so my reports maybe were as long as they were before, Annette, but honestly, they were a lot easier to read and there was a lot more meat in there instead of giving every test under the sun. And then what do you see? You can't see anything.
That's what you mean by simplifying your ed plan. That,
Mm-hmm.
it should be, it not simplified doesn't mean that it's not long. It means that it's plain language that, has meaning and can be used and applied to
Yeah.
accomplish results.
When I started the profession many years ago when I was a teacher, and this is going to date me, we had IEPs on triplicates. So your older teachers would know what that is. It's like a 3 papers. And
Yep.
so I saw many IEPs for students that were in moderate to severe programs that had substantial disabilities. And it was a 2 or 3-page IEP. And it was great. It had everything you needed in there. It was clear. It described things. It doesn't need to be long to be legally sufficient, and it definitely doesn't need to be long to be personalized. So that's the biggest problem in special education is there's so much legalese and there's so much litigation that it is creating more barriers and challenges for families instead of making it easier.
Yeah. Oh, I applaud that so much. Thank you for saying that. We definitely want to make everybody feel and really make it so that everybody is included, everybody's voice is heard. So I know we're running short on time, but I really wanted to talk to you about presumed competence. So I am a huge advocate when it comes to person-centered planning, making sure that the student's voice, however possible, to be heard and included, and their choices be honored. So tell me what you mean by presumed competence and presuming competence and why that's important for you.
Yeah. So presuming competence, or what I like to call strength-based IEPs, is something that's been around for a very long time, Annette, but it is not being practiced in the IEP world. In the medical world, in the adults with disabilities world, I am in California, and we have what's called the regional centers. Person-centered planning is embedded. It is embedded, and it means including the child or the adult student in their plan, asking what their preferences are, their interests, seeing what works for them, having them a part of the team throughout the educational planning meeting. That should be part of IEPs, but we are still kind of encouraged by waiting for the legal age to invite children to come to their IEP. When they do come to their IEP, myself as a school psychologist, we were never trained on how do we incorporate the child into the meeting. We were never trained on, okay, what if we were to invite them before the legal age? Or can we invite students when they are, let's say, a general education student and there's a parent-teacher conference? Can you invite your child? The answer is yes. You can invite your child, even if they're a kindergartner, to your parent-teacher meeting. It's sort of a unique idea in the United States that students are not really part of like any meetings or any concerns. We call the mom, we bring them in. Oh, so-and-so's been misbehaving. Well, what about the child? Why is they're not part of the meeting? So presuming competence to me means that from an early age, no matter what the child's disability is or their ability to be able to speak and express themselves, all individuals, whether they have a disability or not, have the right to be able to fully participate. So if you ask your child, for example, you have a kindergarten child and the teacher calls them in and they're like, okay, we want to have a meeting with you, mom, because your child is really misbehaving. Bring your child to that conference. The reason why is instead of we're talking about a child at a meeting, that means that your teacher has to speak to your child. They're
Right.
going to change their language. They're going to be using terms that you understand better as a mom. And ultimately, they're going to be helping your child to self-advocate by giving them the tools and the resources and the ability for them to express themselves.
Yeah, this
So
is training for the future. We
it's
can't expect
training.
somebody to be 18, 20, 22 years old and all of a sudden they're going to be able to self-advocate. This is training. They need to learn and understand what are their rights, what are their responsibilities, who are they on this team for themselves. It's
Yes.
amazing that it doesn't happen until they're virtually adults, and then we expect them just to know how to do it.
Yes, yes, yes. And one thing I talk a lot about is how to take your IEP or 504 plan and be able to understand the transition to college, whether it's accessing a 504 or
Mhm.
understanding how to access disability supports. And that's a big issue that I talk about all the time, Annette,
Ah,
because schools aren't trained on how to transition kids into that adult role. They talk to them about, okay, you're getting the age of majority, you're going to be turning 18, so you're going
mm,
to be coming to your IEP next year, but they don't train them throughout the process. So that training can start very early on. Like I
absolutely.
mentioned before, when I was a
Yeah.
school psychologist, I would invite students to come to their IEP in middle school.
Mm,
Some of the schools, when I worked at elementary schools, if they would let me, I would say, can we invite so-and-so to their IEP? And they're like, why? I said, because it's their meeting.
yes,
And the kids loved coming to the meeting
of
because
course.
they were like, oh, okay, this isn't a bad meeting. We're talking about like why I get resource. It's not a secret that they go to the speech room. Everybody knows they go to the speech room. So it's not like you're trying to make your child feel less than. You're actually making them feel better because you're saying, what works for you? How is this helpful? Do you like this? Is it good when the teacher does this? Do you want to do that? All
Mm,
of those skills are helpful. All of that person-centered planning is truly a strength-based IEP. And it's going to make your child feel better. It's going to empower them at the table. And ultimately, they're going to make better progress and more meaningful progress because they know what's being worked on and why.
mhm. It'll make the team a better team too. First of all, as we discussed earlier in this conversation, their language will be different. They will be more deferential. They will use more positive language about the child in front of the child. It's a win-win for everybody. Yeah. Oh, this conversation is amazing and awesome, and I wish it could go on forever, but our time is up, unfortunately. What I would love, audience, is if you could let us know what your IEP questions are. And at some point, I'd love to have April come back, or maybe we can meet in our circle of care over in our membership community and have a little bit more of a workshop or something, because this is so important and parents are so undervalued. And of course, the students are undervalued as well as part of the team. So thank you so much for coming today and for being such a great resource for all of us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Annette.
All right. Thank you so much.